you.
Hi everyone. I'm going to stay here because not only have I got a strange accent, I've got a stupid cold filling up my head. So I think I'm going to need the mic, and also I've got a lot of big words in my presentation, so I'm going to need my notes as well. But I hope you'll be able to see the slides here. Really delighted to be here today because it's almost the culmination of a long and growing and I think quite fruitful relationship that I've had personally with Chick and Mike Danson, formerly of this house, UWS, and I'm really excited that Oxfam and UWS have formalised that in an MOU, and I'm really truly honoured to be given this title of a visiting professor. It's really exciting for me. Even though my dad thought it was a typo when the letter arrived. I still don't think he believes it, but I'm really thrilled, and so thank you particularly to Chick, and also to my colleague Francis, who's continuing to build that relationship and help it into maturity. So thank you. Right, I want to think about the way, just as a photographer, look at an overdeveloped photograph, like this one here, and they see that it's been overexposed. To me, there's a parallel in the way that our society is, as Terry's just outlined, experiencing growing health problems, growing inequality, polarization between those who can access decent work and those who are compelled to cycle between low pay and no pay, and of course profound environmental problems. And to me, these suggest that we might just be overexposing our communities and our planet to the wrong sort of growth. And given that that suggests that it's the economy itself that is the problem, I want to make an attempt to talk about the economy without skipping straight to that sticking plaster of welfare or redistribution through tax, because to me that just represents amelioration and mitigation rather than the solution itself. So to me, the solution lies in asking, and when necessary compelling, the economy to do more of the heavy lifting so that we have fewer problems in the first place, getting to that upstream space that Jerry was talking about. And I do have a much longer and heavily referenced version of this paper from what I'm extracting today. But I also want to just warn you that I'm talking here very much as a student rather than as an expert, kind of like I was trying to explain to you the US political system, having just watched a few episodes of The West Wing. So I'm really looking forward to your help and your contributions to this as well. This is just an emerging new field of thinking and reading and exploring that I'm embarking on. So, where are we? The first part of this presentation is going to present some evidence of where we've gone awry in how we configure our economy. The second is quite a tentative attempt to draw together the wisdom of some big thinkers to think about what a better economy might entail. And my shorthand for this is a new economic paradigm. And finally, I want to present maybe a bit more optimistic account of change that's already happening in terms of how we might recalibrate our economy. These show that an alternative, a more humane and more just configuration of what the economy might just look like. They don't constitute a systemic blueprint, nor do they constitute policy prescriptions, but we can come to that later perhaps with the Oxfam UWS Policy Forum. I share a birthday with this guy. He's a Swiss economic historian, though he was born a few hundred years ahead of me in 1773. And almost 200 years ago, he published his principal work, New Principles for the Political Economy, in 1819. In this, John Charles de Sismondi, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, he critiqued the focus of economics as increasing wealth rather than producing enough happiness, and he attacked wealth accumulation as an end in itself and for its detrimental effect on the poor. But he's actually been criticised as lacking positive aims. So what I'm going to do is use his critique of the state of affairs in the 19th century to look at how those problems that he pointed to still characterise our economy today. But then I'm going to draw on some more contemporary thinkers to sketch out what some of the solutions might just look like. So I guess first step is to remind ourselves that the economic model we've got is doing profound damage to the planet. We've risking the very sustainability of our planet. We've exceeded 3 of the 9 planetary boundaries laid out by the Stockholm Resilience Centre in terms of climate change, biodiversity loss and alteration of the nitrogen cycle. And 83% of the world's people live in countries that are using more resources than their countries can renew. No wonder Kenneth Boulding once said, anyone who believes in exponential growth can go on forever on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. But within those statistics is a massive imbalance, because the richest 7% of the world's population are responsible for half of the global CO2 emissions, and the poorest 50% of people emit only 7% of worldwide emissions. This is what D. Sismondi's got to say about inequality. I'm not going to read this out, it's going to take too long, but you can just pick up some of the key words. And he believed, D. Sismondi believed, that where there was insecurity and a lack of participation in decisions that matter, where there was stigmatization, then that nation was enslaved. He was critical of inequality long before Piketty or Obama or even the Pope entered the scene. But the changes that have happened to the economy since he was observing the state of affairs have been substantial. So for example, from the end of the Second World War up until the 1970s, wages roughly followed the expansion of productivity. This underpinned widespread expansion of consumption. The average American and European worker pretty much doubled their standard of living during this time. So the period to the 70s was one, as Jerry showed us through the lens of health inequality, was one of equalization. Some called it the golden age of capitalism. Wealth was used to great effect. Investments in public goods such as health services, schools and parks. But since the 1970s, those trends had started reversing in industrialised countries, particularly the US and the UK. For example, gross domestic products started to separate from other measures such as self-reported life satisfaction, societal well-being, and as you can see here, through real progress such as the genuine progress indicator. I'm happy to tell you more detail about these measures later on, but the point is that you see the divergence. Inequality began to rise. Productivity gains were increasingly captured by those owning capital, and economic growth fed corporate surpluses and high salaries at the top, and trickle down dried up. Now only 12p in every pound of the UK GDP goes to wages in the bottom half of the labour market, and that's down by 25% in the last 3 decades. And our hours of work have also changed. Between 1950 and 73 in all OECD nations, the average working week fell by half a day, which seems pretty good to me. But that's now reversed, and we're now working longer than we did in the 1950s. So the extent to which the economy is delivering for people rather than for profit has continued to be eroded really since the 70s. Our evidence just most recently and perhaps really starkly in rising number of people turning to food banks. The extent to which the UK government acts to perhaps inadequately ameliorate the deleterious impacts of our economic model is significant. If you take out tax and redistribution, Britain's inequality is higher than America's. So let's think about one aspect of that, bad jobs. Traditional economic indicators in recent years have been telling us that we're in a recovery. GDP is incrementally increasing, the employment rate is going up. But D. Sismondi recommends here that what we should do is actually step back and inquire. And he says whether all those who create this wealth are not exposed to more privation. And doing so reveals people are relegated to the low pay, no pay merry-go-round, moving in and out of insecure and temporary jobs that don't lift them out of poverty. Polarisation is growing between the highly paid end of the labour market and those relegated to the lower paid, insecure jobs, between professional and managerial workers who contain considerable bargaining power in their employment relationships, and those who lack the education and the skills to be competitive in those relationships. And of course, Guy Standing has famously coined the term precariat, as it consists of people who feel that their lives and their identities are made up of disjointed bits in which they cannot construct a desirable narrative or build a career combining forms of work and labour, play and leisure in a sustainable way. And just recently, Citizens Advice told us that in the UK, 1.4 million people are on 0-hour contracts, while 1 in 5 earns less than what would be required to have a minimal acceptable quality of life in the UK. And compared to other advanced countries, the UK has a large share of workers who are low paid. There were just fewer demeaning jobs and fewer low paid workers in places like Japan, Germany, Denmark and Canada. But as Jerry's alluded to, bad jobs impact negatively on individual workers, on their families and on the wider community. People with few skills become commodities. They're treated as just-in-time inventory, disposable when the business cycle deems them superfluous, but then on call at a moment's notice. But then when work does not provide social status, esteem and self-worth, mental and physical health deteriorate. The 2010 Marmot Review warned that insecure and poor quality employment is associated with increased risk of poor mental and physical health. So how did we get ourselves into this situation? Now, De Sismondi here uses the words, those nations who have reduced the same classes to slavery. He doesn't say those classes reduced themselves to slavery. He doesn't put the blame on the individuals. Instead, he intimates that there are active processes involved here. He implicitly highlights policy choices and economic decisions matter. Unequal outcomes and bad jobs are not inevitable. So how did we arrive in this situation? UK's economic model results from decades of political choices. For example, some might criticise businesses in the UK, the way they rely on low pay and low quality and price competitive services. Tax, of course, is another factor, productive labour being taxed more heavily and disproportionately in the UK. Another point is pursuit of labour market flexibility, which has seen the replacement of salaried staff with temporary outsourced labour as core periphery models of business proliferate, and weakened trade unions remove one of those barriers to the growth of wage disparities that we saw up to the 1970s. And of course, GDP as a measure of success creates all sorts of perverse indicators and incentives. But to me, these processes feed 3 undercurrents: short-termism, power to employers, and consumption. And so the first of those, tyranny of short-termism. Blind spots are created by the way businesses are set up. They ignore wider social, economic and environmental impacts of their operations. Carl William Knapp warned that capitalism must be regarded as an economy of unpaid costs. Instead, they are shifted to and ultimately borne by third persons or the community as a whole. And this tyranny of short-termism pervades many business decisions. In the 1960s, people held their shares for 5 years. Now the average is about 7 months. But this skewed interpretation of shareholder value and a narrow short-term understanding of fiduciary duty subordinates employees, communities, and environment to shareholder entitlement. Hadrian Chang, the wonderful economist from Cambridge, describes this as an unholy alliance between the professional managers and the shareholders, financed by squeezing other stakeholders in the company. And even Jack Welch, the former CEO of General Electric and reputed coiner of the term shareholder value, has recently acknowledged that shareholder value is the dumbest idea in the world. And so we've got a situation where managerial decisions have become all too detached from the social and environmental impacts of their choices. This is partly underpinned by limited liability, of course, which caps investor risk to that which they originally invested. So they, of course, can enjoy unlimited returns if the firm is successful, but their losses are capped if the firm fails. And such privileges are particularly problematic when set alongside an undermining of labour rights for workers. The UK now has one of the least regulated labour markets in the OECD, which has led to a replacement of salaried staff with casual, temporary and outsourced labour. But concurrently to that shift, other people have been able to reap the rewards from the innovation process that collectively we've all invested in through research and development through the state, and reap returns that are disproportionate to their original contribution. And Lazonic and Mazzucato conclude that the reward system has become dominated by individuals who position themselves, very cleverly position themselves along that process of innovation to extract more value than they create. Excuse me. So you get people just capturing all these benefits that they don't actually deserve or create. And the economic growth of many Western economies in the second half of the 20th century relied heavily on expansion of mass consumer markets. As a marketing consultant, Victor Lebauer famously wrote in 1955, "Our economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals. We need things consumed, burned up, worn out, replaced and discarded at an ever-increasing pace." Now think about the impact on the environment that I talked about earlier. But a natural human fear, very understandable human fear of being exposed as inadequate, of wanting to avoid shame, is exploited by advertising. For many, purchases are no longer about meeting basic needs. They're consumed for their function as symbolic communicators, conveying status, identity, and enabling differentiation or affiliation with others. These processes, of course, are not new. Durkheim highlighted the social environment effects on individual behaviour and emotions, while Bourdieu more recently pointed to a social patterning of consumption and taste via which class status is gained or lost through consumer behaviour. Consumption becomes problematic when it seeks to substitute for real self-development. And neuroscience tells us that people are vulnerable to damaging social comparisons. They lead to rivalry and competitive consumption, which in turn means that we speed up on that hedonic treadmill in our pursuit of positional goods. Juliet Shaw in the US discovered that people are transferring an increased proportion of their time into market activity, manifested in more and more working hours, people purchasing more and more goods and services at later stages of processing. Sachs calls this the paradox of affluence, when greater income does not lead to greater life satisfaction. And the net result is suboptimal pursuit of consumption and overwork as people neglect those activities that actually will better satisfy their intrinsic needs. So that's all depressing, it's all really difficult, but how do we think about moving beyond that into what I call this new economic paradigm? Again, I'm going to leave De Sismondi's words there for you to pick up some of the key words. But to me, in this piece, he seems to give up. He seems a little bit overwhelmed by the entrenched conflict between classes and path dependency that limits our ability to even imagine another way. Gramsci, I think, of course, would quite sympathise with De Sismondi's approach here. But what's really interesting is that his very use of the phrase organisation of society reminds us of the extent to which political decisions contribute to incentives, context and goals. Political decisions matter in how markets are structured, how businesses structure themselves, and the parameters in which businesses operate. And so a tentative sketch of what the tenets of what a new economic paradigm might look like could do worse than looking at this. You don't have to read this, I'll pick some up. Could do worse than looking at three sources. Serge Latouche's 8 R's of degrowth, Peter Victor's macro model of a no-growth future for Canada up until 1935, in which his assumptions point to how we can perhaps reconfigure the economy to manage with no or even lower GDP, and Michael Marmot's evidence of the social determinants of health, such as control, predictability, degree of support, threats to social status, and presence of outlets, which similarly point to changes in economic and social goals. So you don't have to read them all. I'm happy to send this to you if you're interested. But Latouche, for example, talks about re-evaluating social values. He highlights the importance of relocalizing production and decision making, and he talks about the importance of recycling and reusing products rather than just having more and more consumption. Peter Victor, when he was modelling how Canada could survive with no growth, he again talked about stabilising consumption, the need to reduce working time, how we need to strengthen local economies. And Michael Marmot talks about the need for people to have control over their lives, the importance of good, decent work, and also the prevention of ill health, upstream prevention that Jerry talked about. And these are, of course, diverse axioms, but what brings them together is that they're people-focused and they're planet-focused. They require an economy that doesn't breach planetary boundaries, but at the same time lifts people above a social foundation. And I really like Kate Raworth's model of a donut here as a really nice metaphor for this, because, as you can see, it's below that outer ring of an environmental ceiling, but above the social foundation that is the safe and just operating space for humanity. Now, clearly, there's many changes that we need to get ourselves into that donut space. I guess one for each sprinkle on the donut on the left there. And I'm only going to discuss a couple of them now. I'm going to focus on decent work, local economies, business models, and new goals. So just very briefly, how do we get there? So decent work. Work needs to enable people to participate and integrate into society. They need to be able to develop their social networks, contribute to their communities. But, as I've discussed earlier, for too many, work is a matter of drudgery. It offers little autonomy. It positions people at the whim of the employer's demands and the perceived and short-term needs of the business. Research, though, shows us that autonomy, competence, relatedness are three basic psychological needs which result in well-being. So there's something in that we can harness that. There's also evidence that job security and good relationships matter more for job satisfaction than high pay and even convenient hours. Oxfam's Humankind Index for Scotland showed that people place significant priority on security and suitability of work. They need work that pays enough to live on, but above all is meaningful. And work becomes meaningful when it imparts a sense of self-efficacy and self-esteem, when it creates a sense of belonging. So this starts to allow us to paint a picture of the sort of economy that we need, one that generates jobs, that delivers control, autonomy, competence, relatedness, esteem, meaning, and of course sufficiency and security of income. And Denmark is proof that this is possible. Denmark's got a high percentage of high quality employment, about 70%. It has considerable employment security, and it ranks high in terms of employment levels, in terms of social protection and social dialogue on the ILO's decent work agenda. And what's behind this though? Denmark's got a high level of union density, but the nature of work itself is really important. Danish workers have the opportunity for individual participation and for collective voice. They enjoy a high level of task discretion and work autonomy. But equivalent jobs in the United Kingdom are low paid compared to countries such as Denmark because they're broken down into small tasks rather than enabling employees to have a responsibility for a range of tasks. So how work is organised at the firm and worker level really matters, but of course within a wider economic architecture in which power is not entirely ceded to employers. So next one, in terms of strong local communities and robust local economies. When trickle-down economics is so patently not working, the alternative is to build from the bottom up, building robust local economies comprising locally owned, locally orientated, locally sourcing, and locally employing enterprises. This ensures that money stays locally rather than leaking out. Locally owned businesses are associated with higher levels of money circulating in the local vicinity and higher levels of corporate charitable giving and greater social returns on investment. And there's evidence from the US that says for every $100 spent at a locally owned business, that generates an extra $58 in local impact, compared to $100 invested at a pretty equivalent but national chain store, which only generates 33%. So almost twice the impact from spending the same amount of money at a local store. And what's really exciting is that a movement is building in the US to build strong, locally orientated economies. It's called the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. It's not very sexy, but its nickname is Bali. And Bali's agenda is to rebuild for the middle, to engage in fair trade and decentralised power and business ownership. And it's developing ahead of steam over there in the US. In 14 years, it has grown to 50,000 businesses, 81% of which serve low-income and underserved communities. So that's I think, a really point for inspiration of what's happening through the Bali movement in the US. But of course, we also need to move away from individuals functioning simply at the behest of business needs and employer demands. And this requires proactively creating new models of businesses and new models of production in which ownership and management is more widely shared. Social and environmental returns take priority over profit, and which economic decisions are democratised. Power is particularly important here because some vulnerable communities are quite frankly so powerless that they're almost completely excluded from various markets, while others participate on pretty poor terms as just price takers, whether it's labour markets or product markets. So collective mechanisms such as employee ownership, producer cooperatives or community trusts, organisations by which individuals can regain some power or control in these markets. And of course the cooperative model has been around for many centuries, but it's most recently been joined by other, what I call pro-social models and ways of configuring businesses that explicitly seek to deliver social and environmental outcomes, such as community interest companies in the UK and benefit corporations in the US. And in developing countries, there's evidence that when they operate effectively, producer cooperatives allow smallholder producers to share risks and costs, to negotiate collectively, to bargain together, and to have some power and toehold in that marketplace. And in Tanzania, for example, as you can see the photo here, women would usually struggle to raise funds to invest in land and irrigation. But through producer cooperatives where they come together collectively, they can rotate savings and credit, they can increase their incomes, which they can then invest in the welfare and education of their children. And finally, if we're changing a system, we need to think about a repurposing, a realignment of the economy with what people and planet actually need. Now, neuroscience, as I said before, tells us that a shift away from materialistic status and individual pursuits will be actually good for us. Our intrinsic needs are met when we're operating more according to those axioms of a new economic paradigm that I laid out above. A shift in focus to relationships rather than consumption, to cherishing the environment rather than seeking status, to working together rather than in zero-sum competition, and promoting equality rather than wealth accumulation. And at the macro level, an alternative path to development as perpetual growth, without regard to its quality or distribution, is and living well in the broad sense that goes beyond material well-being. It includes spiritual well-being. It goes beyond the individual to include a sense of community, and Baudrillard goes beyond human centrality to include nature. Now, Ecuador and Bolivia are particular advocates. They're breaking with the idea that all countries must imitate the lifestyles and cultures of the industrialized nations. In Ecuador, for example, their President Rafael Correa, after his election in 2007, rewrote the constitution to include self-government for regions, for indigenous groups and for other communities. The new constitution enshrines principles of state control of the economy, and really interestingly, it proclaims the rights of nature and became the first country in the world to do so. This constitutional status positions nature as a subject with a right to be restored and defended. People can petition on behalf of the ecosystem. Correa then launched Ecuador's Plan for Living Well, Plan for Baudrillard, in which he proposes going much beyond, he proposes much more local development as opposed to that sort of export-led economic growth. It's got 12 objectives, which include maximising citizens' capabilities and potentialities, promoting a healthy and sustainable environment, generating stable, fair and dignified work and employment in all its diverse forms, so including unpaid work, and building and strengthening public spaces for intercultural social interactions. And I think our friend Di Sismondi would approve of these sorts of goals. By way of conclusion, here's Di Sismondi talking about the role of government. Policies of that government are for another discussion, and I'm really excited that Oxfam's got this partnership with UWS that actually focuses on policy development. But I think of some of those examples that I've pointed to, the context is really important, but I haven't delved into that. But also, of course, you'll probably be able to be aware of them. There's some tensions and contradictions involved in some of those examples. For example, Rafael Correa of Ecuador is actually a supporter of mega mining projects, and he's criminalised social and environmental struggles. So I don't want to dismiss the tensions around some of these agendas and the importance of context. But I would just want to finish on the main question that I'm actually left asking, which is how much of this needs to happen simultaneously? Or could we embrace perhaps a more incrementalist approach as more people, more communities, bit by bit, move themselves into that donut space, that safe and just operating space? Will there ever be enough sort of individual change that in aggregate might actually constitute a movement towards a tipping point? Are we, as someone like Gar Apoverovic says, in the prehistory of a new revolution? Or do we need to focus on changing the system itself? And in which all those examples that I've provided remain the exceptions that prove the rule. But if that's the case, then these examples are already irritating that system. They're offering a change at the micro, mesi and macro level. And on top of all of that, I think the donut is a really nice irritation of the system at the meta level, which is where the narrative is most important. I'm going to finish there, and we can perhaps talk about later the significance of this overexposure. Thank you so much.